Okay, so you want to own a cattle empire in the American West. Start with the single strangest fact in this entire story, because everything else follows from it. Right after the Civil War, a full-grown Texas Longhorn, an animal that took years to raise and could gore a man to death, was worth about $2 to $4 in Texas. Walk that exact same animal a few hundred miles north to a railhead in Kansas, and it was worth $40, sometimes $80, sometimes more. Same cow, same horns, same forelegs. The only thing that changed was its zip code. That price gap, 10, 15, 20 times the value of the animal, sitting there waiting for anyone willing to walk a few million cattle across open country, is the entire cattle empire in a single sentence. This isn't really a story about cowboys and gunfights, it's a story about arbitrage, real estate you didn't have to buy, and a business model so exposed to a single bad season that it could, and eventually did, lose 90% of its inventory in about 6 weeks. Let's build it from the ground up, because the real numbers behind this industry are honestly stranger than the movies ever bothered to be. Here's the setup. Texas Longhorns descend from cattle the Spanish brought to the Americas centuries earlier. Tough, rangy animals built to survive on scrub grass with almost no human help. During the Civil War, with most able-bodied Texas men off fighting, those cattle did what unmanaged cattle do. They bred, wandered, and multiplied across the open plains completely unchecked. By 1865, conservative estimates put the number of feral, essentially ownerless Longhorns roaming Texas somewhere in the millions. Meanwhile, the war had wrecked the Texas economy so thoroughly that Confederate money was worthless, and there was, quite literally, no local market for an animal nobody in the state had cash to buy. So Texas found itself in an odd position, sitting on top of an enormous natural asset with functionally no way to convert it into money. That's the entire problem this industry exists to solve, and the man who solved it first, at least at scale, is as good a character as this genre ever gets. Charles Goodnight had scouted for the Texas Rangers against Comanche raiders and knew the country better than almost anyone alive. In the spring of 1866, he partnered with an older, more experienced drover named Oliver Loving, and the two men pooled roughly 2,000 head of Longhorns, hired 18 armed cowhands, and set out from Fort Belknap, Texas, aiming for a U.S. Army post at Fort Sumner, New Mexico, where the government needed beef to feed Native American reservations and soldiers, and was willing to pay real money for it. The route Goodnight chose crossed 96 miles of the staked plains with no water at all, a genuinely brutal stretch that could kill cattle by the hundreds if anything went wrong. To keep the crew fed on a drive that long, Goodnight took an ordinary army wagon and rebuilt the back of it into a mobile kitchen, a chuck box full of drawers and shelves bolted onto the frame. He'd just invented the chuck wagon, almost as an afterthought, on his way to solving a much bigger problem. How do you turn a worthless surplus of Texas cattle into cash, 4 legs, and several hundred miles at a time? The route he and Loving blazed, the Goodnight-Loving Trail, became one of the signature cattle roads of the entire era, and Loving himself paid the industry's most brutal cost 2 years later, mortally wounded by Comanches while scouting ahead of a later drive. Goodnight and Loving were solving the New Mexico end of the puzzle. The bigger breakthrough came from a young Illinois businessman named Joseph McCoy, who looked at the expanding railroad network pushing west across Kansas, and saw the other half of the arbitrage. In 1867, he convinced officials at the Union Pacific's Eastern Division to build a rail spur at a sleepy town called Abilene, Kansas, and constructed stockyards there sturdy enough to hold 3,000 restless Longhorns at once, complete with 10-ton scales that could weigh 20 cattle at a time. Herds driven north along a route blazed by a trader named Jesse Chisholm, and forever after known as the Chisholm Trail, could now walk into Texas, cross Indian Territory, and arrive at a railhead with a direct line to the meatpacking plants of Chicago and the hungry cities of the East. In 1871 alone, roughly 700,000 cattle reached the Kansas railheads. Across the full run of the trail driving era, from 1867 into the mid-1880s, historians estimate somewhere between 5 and 10 million head made that same walk. This is, by any measure, one of the largest sustained livestock migrations in human history, and it ran almost entirely on nothing but the price gap we started with. Now let's actually build the business, because a cattle drive wasn't a rancher and a dog walking cows up a road. It was a logistics operation with real, calculable costs sitting against an uncertain payoff hundreds of miles away. A rancher entrusted his herd, sometimes numbering 10,000 head or more, to a trail boss, who in turn hired 10 to 15 cowboys, a cook with a chuck wagon, and a wrangler to manage the string of 100 to 150 spare horses the crew needed to keep everyone mounted. Ordinary cowhands earned somewhere around $25 to $40 a month. Decent money for the era, but a genuine pittance next to the value of the herd they were responsible for. The herd itself moved at roughly 10 miles a day, grazing as it went, watering at rivers and known holes, with successive herds spaced out along the trail so each could find its own overnight stop without piling into the one ahead of it. Every single day on that walk was a day the rancher's entire capital investment was exposed to open risk. Stampedes that could scatter scatter and kill dozens of animals in minutes. Texas fever, a tick-borne disease. Texas Longhorns carried without symptoms themselves, but which devastated northern cattle, leading Missouri and then Kansas to pass quarantine laws that periodically closed whole routes overnight, river crossings that could drown cattle and cowboys alike, and raids from native tribes defending land the drives cut straight through. None of this showed up as a line item on a balance sheet the way a modern business risk would. It showed up as a herd that arrived at the railhead, smaller, thinner, and worth less than the one that left Texas, or in Oliver Loving's case, as a partner who simply didn't come back. That Texas fever quarantine problem deserves a second look, because it's a genuinely early example of one industry's growth colliding head-on with another's. Kansas farmers moving onto homesteads along the very trails the cattle used had every reason to fear a disease that could wipe out their own small dairy and beef stock without ever visibly touching the Texas Longhorns carrying it. As settlement spread west across Kansas through the 1870s, the state kept pushing its quarantine line further and further out, closing whole stretches of the Chisholm Trail to Texas cattle that had used them for years, which is a large part of why Abilene's dominance as the great cattle shipping town was so short-lived. Joseph McCoy's original railhead essentially got farmed out of business within a few years, as the quarantine line forced the drives and the railhead towns that depended on them steadily westward to Ellsworth, then Wichita, then eventually Dodge City. The trail driving business, in other words, was never anchored to one fixed geography the way a normal industry is anchored to its factories or its ports. It had to keep physically relocating itself westward year after year, one step ahead of the very settlement and farming it was in its own way, helping fund. Cattle towns like Abilene and later Dodge City built an entire secondary economy around simply hosting that seasonal collision of cash-flush cowboys and eastbound freight. Saloons, hotels, dance halls, and gambling houses sprang up specifically to catch trail crews who'd just been paid off after months on the trail with no way to spend a cent of it. The exact same short-lived lump sum spending pattern that drove economies in port towns and ocean away. It's worth remembering that this rowdy, famous side of the cattle business, the part Hollywood spent a century turning into the defining image of the Old West, was really just a seasonal side effect. A town's attempt to skim a little of the enormous value passing through its stockyards on its way from a Texas rancher's ledger to a Chicago meatpacker's balance sheet. If the herd made it, though, the payoff really was as dramatic as the opening number suggested. A longhorn worth $2 to $4 on the Texas range could sell for $40 to $80, occasionally more once it reached a buyer in Abilene or Dodge City with a direct rail line to eastern demand. The trail boss sold the cattle and the horses, paid off the crew, and rode back to Texas with the rancher's money, often making the same round trip year after year. It's a business model that required almost no owned infrastructure at all. The cattle grazed on unfenced public land nobody had to buy, the trail itself was free, and the only real capital outlay was the herd, the crew, and the provisions. That combination, enormous margin, minimal fixed cost, is exactly the kind of business that attracts everyone who hears about it, and by the 1870s, everyone had heard about it. Charles Goodnight himself got taken down by exactly the kind of shock this business had no protection against. During the nationwide financial panic of 1873, cattle prices collapsed along with everything else, and Goodnight lost his Colorado ranching operation entirely. He didn't stay down. In 1876, he drove what cattle he had left into the Palo Duro Canyon of the Texas Panhandle, spectacular, sheltered grazing land that almost nobody else had claimed yet, and went looking for capital to rebuild at scale. He found it in John Adair, a wealthy Irish businessman, who agreed to loan Goodnight $30,000 and become his full financial partner. Together, they founded the J.A. Ranch in 1877, and by the time Adair died in 1885, the operation covered more than 1.3 million acres and ran over 100,000 head of carefully bred cattle. Goodnight had gone from a bankrupt trail driver to running one of the largest ranching operations in Texas on borrowed foreign capital in less than a decade, and he was about to have a great deal of company doing exactly that, because by the early 1880s, word of margins like these had crossed the Atlantic, and what followed has a name historians actually use without irony: the beef bonanza. In 1881, an American cavalry officer turned promoter named James Brisbane published a book literally titled The Beef Bonanza, or How to Get Rich on the Plains, and it landed in Britain like a lit match. Pamphlets describing the astonishing returns available on the American plains flooded England and Scotland, and investors who'd never seen a longhorn in their lives began pouring capital into American cattle syndicates. The first mover was the Prairie Cattle Company, founded in 1880 by the Scottish-American Mortgage Company of Edinburgh, sometimes called the mother of British cattle companies, which in its first year of Texas operations bought an existing spread called the LIT Ranch outright for $253,000, 14,000 cattle included. Within a few years, British and other foreign syndicates owned a genuinely enormous share of the largest ranches on the southern plains, run not by the owner personally. The the way Goodnight or the earlier generation of cattlemen had operated, but by hired managers reporting back to shareholders and boards sitting in London and Edinburgh. The single most spectacular deal of the entire boom didn't even start as a cattle transaction. Texas needed a grand new state capitol building in Austin in the 1880s and didn't have the cash to build it, so the legislature struck a barter deal instead. 3 million acres of raw, panhandle grassland handed over to a group of Chicago investors led by the Farwell brothers in exchange for constructing the capitol outright. The investors' construction firm reorganized itself into the Capitol Freehold Land and Investment Company, brought in British money to actually work the land, and launched the operation that would become famous as the XIT Ranch, standing, according to popular explanation at the time, for 10 in Texas, a reference to the 10 counties it eventually sprawled across. The first 2,500 head of cattle arrived at the XIT in the summer of 1885. Within a year, the herd had grown past 100,000. By 1887, it stood at roughly 150,000 head, tended by a permanent crew of more than 150 cowboys earning $25 to $30 a month, all of it run under a genuinely strict company rulebook that banned gambling, banned alcohol, and punished mistreatment of the livestock, which is a considerably more buttoned-down picture of ranch life than the saloon-brawling stereotype the era left behind in popular memory. 3 million acres in exchange for a government building run like a corporation from the very first cow. That's how far this had come from Charles Goodnight, and 18 armed men crossing 96 waterless miles less than 20 years earlier. And underneath all of that foreign capital sat a second, quieter, technological shift that was already rewriting the rules of the entire industry. In 1874, an Illinois farmer named Joseph Glidden patented a genuinely simple improvement on wire fencing, twisting a second strand around the first to hold sharp barbs firmly in place. Cheap enough and effective enough to fence in cattle and land at a scale nobody had managed before. Barbed wire meant a rancher no longer had to depend on the open, unfenced public range that the entire trail driving business had been built around for free. He could enclose exactly the acreage he owned or controlled, keep his own herd's genetics under control by fencing out neighboring bulls, protect his water sources from other outfits' cattle, and just as importantly, keep other ranchers' herds off land he'd started thinking of as exclusively his, even when the legal title on much of that open range was murky or entirely absent. Bigger operations like the XIT were early, enthusiastic adopters of barbed wire specifically to control herds and defend water access, which tells you something important. The same investors pouring money into the open range business model were simultaneously helping build the fences that would end it. Not everyone accepted that quietly. A severe drought hit Texas in 1883, and landless cowmen who'd built their entire livelihood on free access to open grass and water suddenly found huge stretches of the range cut off behind somebody else's wire. Sometimes wire strung around public land the fence builder had no legal claim to in the first place. Sometimes wire that blocked public roads, schools, and even churches. Organized bands of men, some operating under names like the Owls, the Javelinas, and the Blue Devils, rode out at night with wire cutters and simply removed the problem, fence by fence, county by county, across more than half the state. One of the fenced ranchers on the receiving end was Mabel Doss Day, who'd reorganized her debt-laden operation into the Day Cattle Ranch Company, sold half interests in her cattle to investors in Kentucky while keeping full title to her land, and built it into the largest single fenced ranch in Texas, only to have 5 miles of her fence torn down in a single week and to become one of the loudest public voices demanding the legislature do something about it. By the fall of 1883, the wrecked fences represented an estimated $20 million in damage. At least 3 men were dead in armed clashes between fence builders and fence cutters, and Texas's governor called a special legislative session that opened in January 1884 and made fence cutting a felony punishable by up to 5 years in prison, while simultaneously making it a crime to fence off public land in the first place, and requiring any fence crossing a public road to include a gate at least every 3 miles. It's a genuinely rare thing in economic history to watch a legislature try to referee a fight between 2 completely incompatible business models for the exact same land at the exact same time, open grazing on one side, enclosed private pasture on the other, and the fact that the fight required an armed conflict and a special session of a state legislature to settle tells you how much money was actually riding on which model won. By around 1885, several forces that had all been building quietly for years arrived at more or less the same moment, and together they broke the industry that had made men like Goodnight, and made a small fortune for investors from Edinburgh to Chicago. Years of unrestricted grazing, with every new syndicate adding herds to grassland nobody was managing for the long term, had visibly overgrazed huge stretches of the plains, leaving less forage as a buffer against a bad season. Eastern demand for beef, meanwhile, wasn't infinite, and by the mid-1880s, the market was genuinely saturated. So much beef was reaching eastern cities that prices had to fall to keep moving it, which squeezed margins on an industry that had grown used to spectacular return. Barbed wire kept spreading, carving the once boundless open range into smaller, contested, increasingly fenced parcels, on top of the fence wars that had already shown how violently that transition could go. And every rancher, foreign syndicate, and homegrown cattleman alike was still running the same fundamentally exposed bet they'd been running since Goodnight's first drive. Cattle out on open ground with essentially no shelter, no stored feed reserve, and no real protection against a genuinely catastrophic winter. That winter arrived in 1886 and 1887, and it is remembered across the entire Great Plains, from Montana down through the Dakotas, Wyoming, Colorado, and the Texas Panhandle, by one blunt nickname, the Big Die-Up. The summer before it had been unusually hot and dry, leaving grazing land scorched and water sources low heading into the cold season. Then the snow started falling early in November and kept falling, with temperatures in some regions dropping to 55 degrees below zero. Cattle that had survived every winter before on open range simply couldn't reach grass buried under that much snow, and with no rancher anywhere feeding them stored hay at the scale the disaster demanded. They starved and froze standing up, in some documented cases piling up hundreds of yards deep against fence lines as they tried to drift with the wind and found their path blocked. On the LX Ranch, cowboys reportedly skinned 250 carcasses to the mile across 35 miles of range, simply to salvage the hides, and by June of 1887, Dodge City alone had received 400,000 hides from the surrounding devastation. Loss estimates vary sharply by region, which is itself revealing. Roughly 15 to 25% of cattle died across some areas of the southern plains, while in the hardest hit stretches of Montana and the Texas Panhandle, multiple independent accounts put regional losses as high as 90% of the entire open range herd. In Colorado alone, the number of large-scale cattle companies collapsed from 58 in 1885 to just 9 by 1888. One Colorado outfit, the Poudre Livestock Company, lost two-thirds of its herd in a single winter, roughly $400,000 of cattle standing dead in the snow. The Big Die-Up didn't just kill cattle, it killed the entire business model this video has been describing, because it proved in the most brutal way possible that a fortune built on free grass and free weather had never really been insured against either one running out. Ranchers who survived, foreign syndicates, and homegrown Texans alike drew the obvious conclusion: fence smaller, better managed pastures, keep herd sizes matched to what the land could actually support in a bad year, and start putting up hay as a genuine reserve rather than betting the entire operation on an open winter every single time. In 1889, the federal government formally outlawed fencing off public land for private use, closing off the specific legal gray zone that had let outfits like the XIT enclose enormous stretches of land they didn't actually hold clear title to. The open range as an economic model was over. Even Charles Goodnight read the writing clearly enough to act on it. In 1889, the same year that legislation passed, he ended his 11-year partnership with the Adair family and bought his own smaller, more manageable spread near the town that would eventually take his name, trading the scale of an empire for a business he could actually control through the next bad winter. The specific outfits this story has followed didn't vanish overnight, but almost none of them survived as the businesses their investors had originally bought into. The Prairie Cattle Company, the pioneering Scottish syndicate that started the whole rush by buying the LIT Ranch in 1881, struggled on for decades under steadily thinning profits before finally being wound up sometime in the century's second decade. Sources differ on whether it was 1909 or as late as 1918, a slow unwinding rather than a dramatic collapse. The XIT, the 3 million acre giant born out of a trade for a state capitol building, spent years after the Big Die-Up quietly doing the one thing that had actually been reliable the whole time: not raising cattle, but selling off its land parcel by parcel to the farmers and settlers the open range cattlemen had always been racing to stay ahead of. The last XIT cattle were sold off in 1912, and the final scraps of that original 3 million acre grant weren't fully liquidated until 1963, nearly 80 years after the first 2,500 head arrived in the summer of 1885. The land, it turned out, had been worth more than the cattle all along. It just took most investors a couple of catastrophic winters and a few decades to notice. So here's the final accounting, and it's worth being honest about what this industry actually was underneath the mythology. A Wild West cattle empire was never really built on cattle. It was built on the temporary existence of an enormous, unpriced public commons, millions of acres of grazing land nobody owned and nobody charged for, combined with a price gap between Texas and the railheads so large it could absorb staggering transportation risk and still turn a fortune. The moment any piece of that foundation gave way, the free grass got fenced, the eastern market got saturated, or, most decisively, the weather simply refused to cooperate for one single winter. The entire structure had nothing real underneath it to fall back on. Charles Goodnight understood the business well enough to get rich twice and go broke at least once in between. The British and Scottish investors who poured fortunes into the beef bonanza mostly learned the lesson the hard way, watching syndicate after syndicate liquidate through the late 1880s and 1890s as the easy arbitrage that had lured them across the Atlantic simply stopped existing. The cattle empire, in the end, wasn't really an empire of cattle at all. It was an empire built on a gap in a price chart and a stretch of unusually mild winters. And when both of those ran out at the same time, it turned out the empire had never actually owned very much of anything at all.